right, testing, there we go. All right, so if you were here leading up to this, then you saw sort of the reasons, right, that you might want to be here. One of those is that Unbound ID software can save your marriage. It's actually a true story. There was a guy who came up to us at one of these conferences at our booth, says, I didn't buy your software, but my wife did. She no longer gets woken up in the middle of the night, with outages, no longer, has to go work weekends. Your stuff is quiet. It saved our marriage. I'm looking forward to our 6.0 release, which is into the summer, because it has a feature which has your teenage kids listen to you. I've got a 13-year-old, so the big marketing team's not here, so don't put that on our website. It's not true. Okay, so here we're talking about sort of our experience of helping customers modernize their directory servers, directory services, what they're looking for, what their options are, and sort of our experience and what it takes to actually get them upgraded. So I am David Ely, Chief Architect, also co-founder of Unbound ID. And with me today is also Terry Sigle, who, if you were here in the previous talk, he also did half of that presentation as well. He's our sales engineering director. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry. You just sat down. Too late. All right. There you go.
All right, so why are people moving off their legacy directory server environments? We'll go through some of those reasons. Some of the typical drivers is they just really need more scale and reliability. Things aren't slowing down. There's more pressure on directories, not just from the number of entries. You kind of use the entry word for since we're mostly all here talking about directories, but it's also the breadth and the size of the entries. But really, the demands are 3, 4, 5 9 type reliability, and not just reliability, but SLAs from response time. Another reason is the move to the virtualized infrastructure or cloud. A lot of the legacy directory servers really, they aren't supported in those environments, and they have lots of issues in those environments that are inherent to the way that they've been built over time. But customers are moving to the public cloud. A lot of our customers, in fact, the majority of their customers, are in virtualized environments today. There's also the pressure, of course, to contain IT costs, and while you're doing that, by the way, also let's improve security. That's a common requirement that you see today when people are looking to modernize their directory server environment. Also, support for a very diverse range of apps and features. It used to be the day where they were just doing user ID, password, credentials, and it was just a web application that you were protecting, and it was just a LDAP bind, pretty bland. But nowadays, it's actually mobile applications, talking directly to the data store, and not via LDAP, but via other protocols, and we'll get into some of that native support in the directory server. Bottom line, it's really a lack of innovation in the current platform. If you look at a lot of the legacy vendors out there today, and we'll talk about some of this, there's just a lack of innovation. It really has been very little R&D spend in this area in the past 10 plus years. So really, why are the pressures increasing? I mean, today, the days of the previous days of traditional IAM, you see there's really about tens of thousands of identities that are being supported, and again, they're typically over internal apps or sometimes over maybe some external web applications. But again, it's just a very basic infrastructure, and it's usually for supporting internal identities. That's the majority use cases we see. But there's a new paradigm out there in the digital business space. It's not just the internal apps, but it's also partner apps. Like I mentioned earlier, it's mobile applications, it's IoT devices. But that puts an extreme amount of pressure on your infrastructure to support millions of identities, devices, and attributes. And we see this today in our deployments. You also need to provide the ability to have a unified view across those and synchronize information bidirectionally with some of these back-end systems. You're doing that not just from a one profile that you're making available, but also from a security perspective. So what's the weak link? Well, the weak link really, quite honestly, some of the legacy directory servers you see out there today. For those that are familiar with LDAP over the years, we started back in the mid-90s, with the University of Michigan, SLAP-D, Open LDAP, some of the open source implementations out there. Netscape in the kind of mid to late 90s, which turned into the Sun and the iPlanet directory servers, eventually the Sun 1, and eventually the acquisition by Oracle. That really represented a period of innovation from about 1995 to 2005. And that innovation really kind of stopped at that point. It really became a bug, and it really became a patch and fix strategy beyond that, and from 2006 to present. And we see a lot of these products being end-of-lifed. Here today to talk to you about some different solutions for moving forward from that and how things have changed. So what kind of questions should you be asking when you're looking to potentially replace an environment like this? If you find yourself in a situation where you're looking for some a different solution, what are some of the questions that you should be asking? Is this solution future-proof? Is it something that's going to be relevant 6 months, 18 months, 36 months, 5 years down the road? Is it based upon a foundation that's going to be able to scale as your needs scale? What security features should you look for? You should look for something that's going to have end-to-end security. I mean, it's not really a choice anymore. A lot of the existing solutions don't provide end-to-end security from an encryption perspective. You're having to bolt on additional tools just to get to the security levels that a lot of times your security and audit department requires. Does it support fine-grained privileges, or do you kind of have to give the keys to the kingdom to a single administrator? How will it scale, and how will performance improve over time? A lot of customers say, well, today I've only got 1 million users, and we have maybe about 4 or 5 attributes within our current LDAP directory. But then they get requests to add on, well, how about these other 10 attributes? And by the way, some of these attributes are big blobs of data. By the way, for every user now, we also need to track 2 or 3 devices. And you start seeing the multiplier effect here on the data. And we see this not just in the size of the directory, but how many transactions, how many applications are hitting this. Will legacy and modern apps be supported? So how do I support my old legacy LDAP applications while at the same time I'm trying to support some of the new modern applications, specifically mobile devices, applications that are constantly hitting your data store, not just from a credential perspective, from an LDAP bind, but also pulling data and writing profile and preference data. Is it going to support modern APIs? Can you talk to it via REST natively? Skim by sending things like JSON attributes to it versus just traditional LDAP attributes. And how will you get there? And David will talk about this a little bit later on, but is the migration going to be seamless? It has to be seamless. You don't have the option to be down for a period of time. In some cases, we have customers, like in the telco space, that they can't be down for more than a millisecond. And so that's just not an option. How do we do this migration from an existing infrastructure to a new infrastructure seamlessly? How will it support the cloud and virtualization, and how will that transition go? How can I go from a dev test to a prod environment in a very easy way, deploying things in an automated way? How can I scale horizontally as I need more performance? And again, how much will it cost? Again, that's probably the first question that's being asked. But how much will it cost? What should the TCO should be reduced, and the TCO is not just the cost of the hardware, cost of the licenses. It's really comes down to the management of it. In a previous session, we were talking that customers today are living with they'll reboot their servers once a day, because that's something that they do today, and that's something that's required because of maybe the way that the legacy application's running and the way for them to clean up memory and so on. So there's lots of reasons for that. So let David come up here and talk about what some of the options are.
All right, thanks, Terry. First option is honestly Unbound.ID's biggest competitor when we get into a deal, and that's to just do nothing. So people have infrastructure that it's painful to them, as he talked about. They're willing to go through the pain of restarting every day, but the thought of like trying to move everything to something else is just something they don't even want to think about, right? That if they're doing it right, they've got lots of applications using the shared identity data, and the thought of having to change those applications to use a new store is just something they don't want to do, right? But we'll see that there's actually a better way. Option number two is just to kind of make what we consider a lateral move. Those of you who've been in the identity space for a while, recognize a lot of the logos up there for other directory vendors out there. I can tell you that the grass is not always greener on the other side, since every company you see up there has had one or more customers move to Unbound ID. To my knowledge, nobody's gone in the reverse direction. So if you're going to consider these options, the things you really want to consider, the things that Terry has talked about. One, are you going to have to update your applications to work with these new directories? Two, how do they scale? You'd be able to rely on vertical scalability, bigger systems, more hardware, more memory that easily scaled faster than you added customers or added employees. Now there's a push to use virtual machines, right? So you have smaller and smaller systems. So you need to have solutions that perform well there, as well as can scale horizontally. Third, you need to make sure that, sorry, I had a third, but I drew a blank. Third, you need to make sure, what is it going to take to get there, right? Terry talked about an easy migration. You actually have them demonstrate to you, what is it going to take to move from your current environment to their environment? Do the applications continue to work? What do you need to do if you have to roll back? Okay, the third option, and this is attractive, right? It's a very cute option, nothing like a bunch of free kittens, is to actually build it yourself. And this is attractive for several reasons. One, it's very cheap or even free to run a lot of these NoSQL solutions. NoSQL and big data are very in vogue. If you go and look at, and they're great technologies, don't get me wrong, but if you look at the Wikipedia page for NoSQL, you'll see, I think there's about 50 different options out there, right? So there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution. They're attractive to developers, right? They're schemaless. It's very easy to write applications. You could probably stand up an identity data store on top of one of these in a matter of a couple weeks, right, if you're going to write it yourself. And they handle the whole cloud deployment, infinite scalability, horizontal scalability. They got all those things covered. What are the gotchas? So we've actually seen a few customers try to go down this route, including some that are IAM vendors, right? And this is essentially what they end up with, right? So they have Cassandra there on the back end. That's where they store almost all the user information. Cassandra handles all the replication, availability, consistency of the data there. What you find, though, is that it can't handle all the searches that you want to do. So you install Elasticsearch, and you get the data over there as well. You don't want your applications to have to talk to two different stores. You don't want your applications to be tied to one of these specific NoSQL solutions. So what you have to do is you put a API layer in there like MuleSoft. That's what they used in this case. So MuleSoft can decide, does this query need to go to Cassandra, or does this query need to go to Elasticsearch? Also, it enforces access control there. So, since you don't want applications to be, have direct access to these NoSQL solutions, which often don't have very good fine-grained access control. Finally, the question is, what do you do with your legacy apps? Are you going to rewrite them to use this new API you've put in MuleSoft? Are you going to keep your legacy environment around for a while and synchronize to it? Are you going to try to produce an LDAP type interface in MuleSoft for these applications to talk to? So this, there's a lot of moving parts in this picture, and this is just really the data access. If you're going to build an identity store, there are some other things that you have to think about. Password management is a big one, right? Even big companies like LinkedIn have proven that you really have to know what you're doing when it comes to managing passwords. So I'm sure everybody saw there's a big leak of LinkedIn. I guess it was about 2012, but they just started selling that data recently. I got an email that said, hey, you should probably change your LinkedIn password from them. One thing that really stood out to me in that email is it said, hey, since 2012, we started doing some smart things with our passwords, like adding salt to the hash and the password, right? So prior to that, things that have been best practice for decades, right, they weren't even doing, right? So you don't want to be in the process of managing passwords, password policy, account lockout, all that kind of stuff yourself. You also have to think about data consistency. So in this picture, we've got data in Cassandra, we've got data in Elasticsearch. How do those two things stay in sync? I can tell you that there's no way that natively in Cassandra you can get changes out of it. So you have to think, I'm just going to do kind of a bulk resync. Am I going to update my API layer to push data to both places? What if it fails, if it goes to one? You got to think about those kind of things. Security and access control. So you've got to build the security into the API layer, the access control there. Thinking about fine-grained privileges. Okay, how are people going to keep from escalating their privileges and gaining access to this data? Change synchronization. As much as we tout, you should have one repository for all of your data, and that should be on Bound ID, and everything should talk to that. The reality is that you're going to have lots of other systems of record that you need to push changes out to. And a lot of these NoSQL solutions, most of them in fact, don't provide a way to detect changes and push those changes out to other stores. That's a really big limitation in my opinion. You also have to think about encryption at rest. Do these things, they must natively support encryption at rest. It's not something that you can add on after the fact. And of course, auditing. Right? You got to have a trail of all the access, so that the logging is something that you have to do as well. So the real question is, you might have some really sharp developers, but why are you having them spend time, outside of your core competency building this stuff? I understand that it's, would be very fun to build, but they should be focusing on your business instead. Next slide. All right. So obviously, we're giving this talk. We've had a lot of successful customers that have moved to us, so we think that there's a better solution. And Terry's going to go into some more details for what that looks like.
All right, so you may be asking, well, what are some of the modern directory features? And in fact, a lot of times when we talk about this, folks don't think, well, those aren't directory features. Those are, maybe in some cases, NoSQL features. And we'll go through some of these and what you get from an Unbound ID data store solution. So it should be something that supports modern apps and application developers. And in this, you see at the core there, beyond the centralized security, there you see different protocols. It needs to be more than just LDAP. It needs to be REST over SCIM. It needs to support OAuth 2 tokens as a form of authentication. In fact, it should support many authentication different styles, such as not just user ID password, but certs, Kerberos. One-time passwords over SMTP, over SMS, TOTP, and it needs to support these things natively, not requiring an additional layer. Now we realize, and especially with folks like Ping, we realize that there are some access management solutions that do layer that on top of a data store, and they in fact do that very well. But in cases where applications are talking directly to the data store, they need to be able to talk to us via REST. Presenting an OAuth token, to get authenticated. Also leveraging a centralized security control. We're going to talk about this just kind of as a single monolith, directory, but really it's going to be something that's distributed, and you'll see a slide later on from a replication perspective. But from a security perspective, the controls should, as they're replicated, those controls should be a centralized security model across all your data stores. Also, the unification of data silos, and we'll talk about that briefly with our data sync solution, but we should be able to pull those data silos into one single repository, and through that publish the common identity services, again, through kind of a REST API when we think about publishing those services. Support for structured and unstructured data. So as I mentioned earlier, you think of kind of a rigid LDAP schema, basically your object class, attribute definitions, and so on. That's great. It's great for supporting applications that are talking LDAP to the data store. But what about unstructured data? If you've seen any of the applications being built, any of the mobile apps being built, they're all talking REST, they're all talking JSON objects. The Unbound ID data store supports unstructured data natively out of the box. So we have an object, we have an attribute syntax of JSON, and it's going to validate that that's a valid JSON. It's going to parse it as valid JSON, name value pair objects. And within that, it's going to give you the ability to index attributes within that JSON object. So imagine, instead of just having LDAP attributes, you now have the ability to support JSON objects natively within your data store. And not only have access to that data via REST, but also be able to do queries on that via LDAP and against the attributes that have been indexed within those JSON objects. All that being done over the REST API, SCIM with OAuth 2 support. And you can see the example there where a customer identity made up of several different items: personal preferences, social media preferences, geolocation data. All of those might be different forms of JSON objects that are stored within the data store. There should be a broad deployment set of options available to you, and this really leads to a lot of cost savings. So when we 5 years ago, I'd say the majority of the implementations were still on hard iron, on blades, on servers that are being deployed. I would say today the vast minority are on hard iron. Today we see a lot of most data store implementations being done on VMware systems. We are VMware certified. We are supported environment. You call for support, and of course we pick up the phone and say absolutely. Where you won't see that with some of the legacy vendors. Of course, they'll be more than happy to support you over some of their own OVMs, or virtual machines, I should say. But we run, a lot of our customers run in the public cloud, whether it's AWS, Rackspace, Azure. It's the public cloud, whether it's in the public cloud or whether it's a private or a hybrid approach within a company. Platform independence is a big item here. We are 100% pure Java solutions, so we give you the ability to run this on virtually any platform that runs the JVM. Okay, that can range anywhere from a 64-core Solaris machine, if you're still running those, or it can range all the way down to a Raspberry Pi that's in my backpack right now. So whatever can run the JVM, you can run the Unbound ID data store solution. And because I mentioned the Raspberry Pi, it has a very minimal footprint. You'll be amazed when you take a look at this, the minimal footprint that the application takes, not just for the bits, but also the data that it stores on disk, the storage of the actual the data store, the entries, the type of tokenization and compression that happens when we import data into the data store. Typically, it's a fraction of what you would think of a common, LDIF representation. So if you have a gig LDIF file, it may end up being, 600 meg, from the database perspective. So when you're looking for a modern directory, you also need the ability to integrate with different preferred deployment frameworks. You need to be able to do automation via scripts. The next two come hand in hand, auto scaling and horizontal scalability. As your needs arise with your business, and we see this a lot of times in the cyclical business where you need to throttle up the number of instances because maybe it's tax time or maybe it's a certain holiday or whatever. You're a retailer and for Black Friday you need to throttle up. You need to be able to do that in a horizontal way and simply add on additional instances. And this needs to be done in an automated, scripted way. Not with someone going in and, clicking on a bunch of buttons to do an install and, trying to, get more instances up and running. Also, you need to have dashboards that gives you insight as to how the application's running. We have an analytics engine. If you were in the last session, we talked briefly about it, but it provides you the ability to get data from all the Unbound ID services, the data store being one of those, and tell you how the data store is running, not just from a LDAP perspective, not just from a REST perspective, but also how's the machine running, how's the CPU, the memory, how's the storage looking on the machine. There's about 126 different statistics that we make available to our analytics engine. You'll start getting information that you never had before with a legacy directory. So you should also expect data replication at performance. It's very reliable. We are a multi-master architecture that business of hubs and suppliers and consumers and stuff, that's long gone. There's no need to manage multiple replication agreements. If you have n nodes and you have a fully meshed network with legacy directories, it's typically n times n minus 1 agreements. And that is it's a pain to manage. If you've been there, you understand. Instead, you simply register a new node that comes onto the network, a new node with another data store that you have deployed. And the act of that registration then brings it into the registration topology, whether it's in that same data center or whether it's geographically in a different data center. In this case here, you see a WAN where you have several data stores within different data centers across the world. They are geographically location aware, meaning that when you deploy a data store, it's aware of what location it's in. And so what that means is it optimizes how it talks locally to data stores versus how it would go to the network in a different geographic location. There's a lot of optimizations that occurs when it needs to replicate data from a data center in Hong Kong to, let's say, a data center in San Francisco. Everything is encrypted over the wire. We'll talk about security in a second. From a data management perspective, it's over-the-wire binary initialization. Yeah, believe it or not, that's faster than exporting the data, moving it across the wire with the SCP, for example, and then importing the data. We do all the binary initializations over the wire. And we do have an optimized replication protocol instead of being based upon the LDAP protocol that you're familiar with in the past. From a backup restore perspective, because of the efficiencies we have in the database, we can do full and incremental backups, meaning that instead of doing a full backup of your 100 million entry directory, you can do incremental backups maybe on the hour. And you're only going to get the changes that happen within the last hour. Because of the way we do our internal database, it's a Java logging database, we have the ability to do those incremental backups, and it's extremely efficient. We also provide the ability to do those backups with compression and with encryption and signing to ensure that there's been no tampering of the database. From a security perspective, we do look at it from an end-to-end perspective, from the life cycle of an identity or whatever data you're managing. The very first moment it enters the network, via SSL, via LDAP-S, start TLS, to the point where it's in memory, encrypted in memory, to the point that it's encrypted on storage. And then beyond that, to the point that it's being replicated to other nodes via public-private key pair relationships between those different replicated nodes, to the point where it's being backed up, and not just being backed up in the clear and then last step encryption, it's actually encrypting it as it goes. So there's never any point during that whole process where that data is in the clear, and that's extremely important. We'll talk a little bit about some of the verticals that we support, especially like in the financial space. You see a box there with all the centrally enforced security components. Just to cover a few of those, from a password policy, you'll see that we have a password policy that's really second to none out there, whether it's your traditional, what you're used to with AD or some of the legacy directories. We support all those concepts and quite a bit more. I invite you to take a look. From that fourth bullet there, the fine-grained delegated admin, and that's an important one. You should be able to delegate administration for different aspects of the server, whether it's start and stopping, whether it's managing schema, whether it's managing ACIs. you shouldn't just give out that directory manager type credential to everyone. It should be something that you delegate different privileges to. If you look at the, I mentioned the data layer encryption, whether it's on disk and memory or it's in motion. Again, just to reiterate, the encryption from a backup files perspective and change histories, everything. We do take security extremely seriously here. So let me let David come back up and talk a little bit about how a migration might look and might work.
All right, thanks, Terry. So usually when we get in a sales cycle, we talk to customers, they get really excited about our technology, but then always the question is, how am I going to get there, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what those migrations look like, because a lot of people are scared of this, right, which is a forklift migration. What could go wrong? You're trying to do a hard cut over from what you're currently on to something new, right? And how are you going to get back to what you had before if there's a problem like this? Instead what people want is a simple, I wouldn't say simple, but a safe, zero downtime transition with a safety net. If you have to go back to what you're using before, then you can. We've never had anybody do that, but it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Okay, so what does that look like? So here you have what you have today, legacy applications talking to your legacy repository. So what does it look like when people first get Unbound ID into the picture? We have one of our products, our data sync product, which is heavily used during migrations, can synchronize your legacy data, whether it's in a LDAP repository, whether it's in a relational database, synchronize that over to the Unbound ID platform. You can do testing. Sometimes you have to do some data cleansing, as we heard in our previous talk. After you build up some confidence around that, you can start to develop some new applications that are leveraging some of the new features that Terry had mentioned earlier. Things like the REST interface, the directory, unstructured data that you have in JSON, advanced authentication schemes that don't involve passwords, right? So you can authenticate with your phone. Those changes can even synchronize back to your legacy repository that we see there. Over time, you can begin to migrate those apps and not even make changes to the application, just change how they're configured to talk to our store instead of the legacy store. Over time, you've migrated all those apps, right? The apps are now talking to our server. The customer Terry talked about earlier that was going through the pain of restarting their servers every day. They went through that pain because they had 5,000 applications, and they thought there's no way I'm going to be able to move to anything else. Finally, we got in there. We convinced them to give us a try. They set a timeline of getting the apps moved over, I think, in 90 days. And actually, we had completed that in just 30 days. So it was a lot easier than even what they thought was an aggressive timeline. The nice thing here is you can keep that legacy repository around as long as you need to. Right, we've had customers keep it around for a few weeks, right? Pretty aggressive. We've had some leave it around for 6 months after they've deployed us, just in case there's some problem. They knew that they had a safety net to go back to. Like I said earlier, nobody's needed to use it, but it always helps people to know that it's there. Eventually, you can retire that old hardware. Okay, so a big question. There's a move to try to get rid of passwords, to use other ways to authenticate. But passwords still represent the majority of ways that people authenticate to applications, right? And customers are especially concerned with, hey, I've talked to these other vendors. They tell me that I'm going to have all my users reset their passwords in order to move to their system. I can't do that. Users don't like it. It increases support sales calls. What can you do for me? And we've done a lot to help customers through this. And I'll talk about that. Regardless, the goal is the same. You want to end up in the Unbound ID server with a password that's encoded in a very strong form. So it used to be things like, back in the day, MD5, nobody's going to be able to crack that. Now like salted SHA-1, for a long time that's been a storage scheme that has been pretty safe, although they're beginning to make recommendations to phase that out. Now kind of the best practice is some of these schemes like PBKDF2, scrypt, bcrypt, which are especially expensive hashes to compute because it makes it that much harder to crack these passwords with GPUs that you can go and get on Amazon Web Services, custom hardware even for cracking some of these things. So that's really what people should be moving to for storing their passwords. So you want to be able to get there, and like I said, you want to get there without any disruption in your user service. You don't want people to have to reset their passwords. So there's really 3 different starting points for where you can be. You can have some hash passwords. It can be in a format that we understand natively. There's a bunch of those. That's going to be the easiest approach. You might have some custom password hashing algorithm that you use internally that you've written. Maybe the salt is computed from the username. Maybe the salt is stored separately. We'll talk about that. And then finally, if you don't have any access to the password in that legacy system, I can show you what those customers do. Okay, so here we have an application that's authenticating to the Unbound ID data store, the legacy directory that's out there, whether it's Sun, Oracle, OpenLDAP, OpenDJ, those other servers out there. You don't even need to have that in the picture, right? It's still there. Maybe you're still synchronizing to it, keeping it up to date. But we understand that password hashing format. We're able to check that password. Once we've checked it, then we're going to re-encode it with what you said, yes, this is the scheme I want to use. I want to use PBKDF2 because it's fun to say. No, it's also very secure. So once we re-encode it, then we'll send result back to the client and say, yes, success. The next time through, we don't have to, we see, oh, this is encoded with the strongest form. It's what you want. Send result back to the client. So as soon as every user's authenticated, or each user's authenticated, we've re-encoded that password, and we no longer have the weaker forms stored out there. So if you do have a data breach, right, they get past these hash passwords. It's an internal attack. They get past the other encryption. Then you're not going to have a LinkedIn type moment of having all your weak hash passwords available for sale. Okay, very similar to that is if you have a custom password encoding scheme. This is something that we don't support natively. The picture really doesn't change much. All it is you write some code using our server SDK to sort of check. Here's the user's clear text password. Does it correspond to this hashed form? Yes or no? We've had several customers, go through this approach. Everything else is the same. That happens the first time through, the second time through, third time through. We just check that very strong form. All right, the next picture is we don't have any access to the password. And what we do here, you see that the legacy directory, whether it's Active Directory that in the past used to store passwords using MD4, which you could crack like in under a second. So it's no surprise that they didn't want to open that up to anybody. I'm sure they do something better now. So user authenticates to Unbound ID, gives us the username and password. We're able to use that to go off and connect, use pass-through authentication to connect to one of these remote servers and check the password. If it comes back, yes, this is a good password, we say, okay, we know we now have the user's clear text password. We're going to encode it like we did before with a strong form, store that locally in the directory. We now have that user's clear text password. Send result back to the client, successful authenticated. Next, we don't even have to access, for that user, don't have to access the remote store anymore. So we had a large bank that took this approach. They were really worried about having to reset all their passwords. But they found out about this and they were really happy. They said, okay, all we need to do is we send an email. We say, everybody log into your account in the next 60 days and we'll make sure they gave some excuse. It wasn't to say we're going to move to Unbound ID. It was to make sure that, refresh something or other. And they got almost all their passwords moved over. They had a handful of users that had to reset their password, but it was, a very small minority. Okay, so I think I'll invite Terry up here. We'll talk a little bit about some of our example deployments. Here you go. I'll give you the clicker.
So maybe first just to talk about some of the different industries that we do deploy into. It's actually quite a large number of industries. And what I want to show in this slide here is that it's not that they're just focused on these 2, maybe 3 different items, but this is kind of the big hit, the big ticket items that we see across the different industries. And I won't go through all these, but like financial services, for example, obviously security is a huge one. Example there, I'd say, is that that's the industry that we still typically find them deploying on hard iron versus maybe a virtualized environment. It's changing, but security is a huge item there, as well as performance. As David mentioned, in some of the large banks, they would deploy over to us. In fact, a great story, the bank said, I think about 2 days into it, they were getting support calls. So I think your password management system, I think it's like something's going wrong. I think it's not working correctly, because it's almost like the query comes back immediately within milliseconds. Before, it was taking them about a second and a half. And said, no, it's correct. We verify it with the logs, and it's running. So from a performance perspective, customers are amazed that again, typically we measure these in matter of milliseconds. If you go across like to the consumer space, there we do see a lot more requirements around unified profiles, and that brings into use cases with things like our sync server. And that's because some of these large retailers, especially on the internet, where there's brick and mortar, there's loyalty programs, there's web commerce. They've got several different siloed backends, and they're trying to pull those backends together into one experience. So, and you'll see some of those retailers on the next slide. Beyond that, telco, obviously scale. And when we talk about scale in telco, we're talking about massive scale in the, typically response is measured in the single milliseconds, SLAs that are extremely aggressive and with zero downtime. And that's where we typically see things like, the 4 or 5 nines required SLAs as far as 5 or 6. And we're easily surpassing those. So if we look at some of the different players in some of these different industries, these are just some of the players you see up here. Earlier today, you saw the presentation with Motorola and some of what we're doing with the secured, from the security perspective, across some of the programs they have in place for emergency personnel. And then you also saw in the previous section with Tech Data, you'll see there in the lower right, a company that we're working with who's a distribution. But you can see across really every one of these industries, we've got a pretty firm foothold. And again, the types of things that they're looking for is it really is around, across all these, performance, security, scale, and unified profiles. And if you want to say something about some of these.
Sure. What's actually good is, I know about a handful of these, but the majority, I don't really know how they're using our software, right? And the reason I say that's a good thing is that usually I find out about things when there's problems, right, or there are things that don't work. So, there's a few of these that were more challenging. We've talked about some of those already. Certainly in the telco space, that was where we got our start. Thinking about being on the call path. Every time you make a phone call, it's going to hit one of our servers, or send a text message across major U.S. carrier networks that hits one of our servers. The amount of testing and performance and response time reliability, was certainly eye-opening to me. That took a while for us to get there. The great thing is all those other customers who think they had performance problems or high performance requirements, we're able to easily meet those because we've kind of gone through and earned our stripes in the telco space. Other things that kind of come into mind in this picture are customers that had a very large monolithic deployment and moved from they were told by their vendor, okay, you can't buy hardware fast enough to run this anymore. In 2 months, right, at this scale, you have Fusion IO cards, you have the system maxed out in memory, you just can't push it any further. So they moved to us, they moved to virtual machines, they ended up using 1/8 of the hardware that they had before, and they had, I think, 5x the performance, right? So that's, again, something our marketing team, I don't want you to put on the website because, not everybody's going to get that same level of performance, but it's actually not atypical for us. Let me see the other things that come to mind. Yeah, so a lot of the banks, right? I've talked about that a little bit earlier, right? They're very particular about, when you do migrations, you got to have, no impact to your users, right? Because for them, they lose a customer, they lose a lot of money, and again, very stringent on the security requirements, right? We get these security questionnaires from these banks, and they say, okay, you have to answer all this stuff. And we've gone through it, we have good answers. So hopefully from a security point of view, seeing banks up there, performance point of view, to seeing the telcos. Also the having support in the tech space, right? I mean, for developers, right? We have developers using our stuff, they really like having the blend of having a store that's used by legacy systems, but also being able to use it using modern interfaces such as REST and unstructured data like JSON, which you get in things like MongoDB. So I think that's about it. We've got about 4 minutes for questions, 3 minutes and 56 seconds according to this clock. So if there's any questions, then we're all here to answer them.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to this is some of these vendors some of these customers up here, they just use this from a REST perspective. I mean, they really the applications and the users would never even know that there was an LDAP directory under it's another protocol and stuff. So just to add on to the fact that people are using this product as to really support their modern applications and stuff. So any more questions? One thing I want to say, if you get a chance, take it for a spin. There's a URL at the bottom there, but if you just go to our homepage, unboundid.com, you'll see at the very top there's a free trial. Check it out. It takes you literally a matter of seconds to put your information in. We'll send you an email with a download link. You'll be able to download it, and you'll be up and running in about 5-10 minutes, however long it takes you to click through some check boxes on a GUI. I would say also that there's the ability that we do offer an AMI in Amazon. So if you've got an Amazon account, you can also fire up that AMI and run it, and it's already fully installed in the AMI, so you can take it for a spin. But I invite you to do so. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. So with that, any questions?
So what is the data store behind the LDAP?
Excuse me?
Data store behind the LDAP. It can be another database like that. For example, in Open LDAP, you can configure different database, right?
So the data store, LDAP is just one of the protocols that's supported with the data store. As far as the underlying database, it's a name value paired Java logging database is what's being used, but it's
A little bit about the proxy, so you proxy consider from Open LDAP if that was the question.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you do have Open LDAP as part of the picture, we do have a proxy server which can talk to different LDAP servers, whether it be ours or Oracle DSCE, Open LDAP, Active Directory. Some customers will use that as part of the migration, so they'll first put the proxy in. Some apps can talk to Open LDAP, other apps will talk through it to us. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
And in the multi-data center setup, how do you replicate the data?
So there's a custom protocol that we use, wire-based protocol for replication. We don't guarantee, but most of the time, each change that happens is only go over the WAN once, so that you're not sort of doing broadcast everywhere between all servers. It's called WAN-friendly replication. Also, all the communication is encrypted with TLS using public, and as well as authentication. So we have public-private keys used for authenticating the server, so it's possible to do that encryption over the public internet. You don't have to have dedicated connections for that. As Terry said, encryption is set up more, you sort of join replication or leave replication as opposed to having to set up tons of individual sort of pairwise replication agreements. So does that answer your question? Yes, okay. Other question? Yeah, question there?
Just curious, really, I saw data obfuscation as one of the points on your slide. What's the use case around that? Is it, test and dev, or is it?
Yeah, so test and dev is certainly one of those. So the sync server that we saw there has the ability to synchronize data from your production environment into a test environment and to maintain certain structures of that data like it looks like an email address, it looks like a phone number, it looks like social security number, but to transform it in a way that it's no longer a real social security number, a real email address, so that in a test environment, you can have more assurances that you're actually testing with something like your production data compared to some synthetic data that you can't reproduce the problems you see in production. But the server itself actually supports some amount of obfuscation. So if you want to only allow people to retrieve, the last 4 digits of a social security number, for instance, you can do that kind of thing as well.
How does the REST API work? Is it like wrapper over the LDAP layer, or directly talk to the
So it's supported natively. So the directory has an embedded HTTP stack within it, and it natively supports sort of REST calls into the data.
So in the, like, it won't do another LDAP call, right?
The LDAP call is just internal to the server. So it doesn't have to call out to another server. It's not like a REST gateway or proxy. It's supported natively. The performance cost is really just the HTTP. If you're going to use HTTP, that has the bigger performance cost than anything that we have to do internally. But for most of our customers, they're still can do 10,000, 20,000 sort of REST operations per second, which is well beyond what they need. Okay, another question here.
What's your licensing model? Is it like site license, user license?
We're a very small. No, we're not very. We're a fairly small company, and so we're very flexible in that regard. So whatever works for you guys, whether it's sort of per server license, per core license, per entry pricing, enterprise-wide license. I think we're pretty flexible there. Stereo works in sales, so he can probably answer more if that's not enough for you. Is that good or?
Yeah.
Okay. No, there was back there.
How's the validation of the OAuth token? Do you need like a ping of federate or some sort of ping identity proxy behind it, or is it self-contained example that I can
I think I know the answer, but I'll let him answer.
Yeah, so from an OAuth perspective, when we receive a token that's part of a REST request, and that's the authentication, we then can take that REST, that OAuth token, verify it with whoever has minted that token. So we would kind of need to know, who that trusted provider would be of that OAuth token. Now, in our case, it may be our data broker, it could be Ping Federate, it could be any other OAuth 2 provider out there.
Do you leverage the scopes within that OAuth token as well? I mean, is that defined from an access control standpoint?
So good question. So as part of, so the question was, do we honor the scopes within that OAuth 2 token? It depends on how that comes in, because obviously it can come in as just a token itself, which we have to go retrieve those scopes that are part of that token when they authenticate it, or maybe we may have additional information through a JOT token. So we offer through our SDK, you can interpret that token and go verify that content. That really is a custom SDK endpoint, which is, again, we didn't go into it, but our server SDK is all Java based, and so we have examples out there for how we talk to ourselves or Ping Federate, and you basically need to take a look at that token. Potentially, in your case, you're talking about going back and getting scopes. So if they had a certain scope that was part of that and it was allowed, then it may allow different operations from being performed or different attributes. So, any more questions? All right, with that, you may have seen on your chair, you may have seen like the invitation. We are having a little event tonight at Muriel's. I would invite you to come along and partake in the festivities, and we can also continue our discussion tonight if you have any more questions. So with that, we thank you very much.